What a horrible smell, I muttered, feeling humiliated and drenched in wine. My eldest son's wife, Catherine, her eyes cold and filled with disdain, had spilled the wine over me as I lay sick in bed, feverish and weak. Even in my dazed state, I couldn't ignore her mocking laugh as she walked away. It seemed surreal. How could she treat me like this? Years ago, I would never have imagined such a situation. But here I was, lying helplessly in my own home, being mistreated by someone who'd married into our family. My husband and I had built this home together, raised 2 sons here, and dreamed of a peaceful life in our later years. Now, that dream was slipping away. As I lay there, I remembered how this all began a year ago when my son John brought Catherine into our lives. She'd been a shock to my senses from the very first moment. Dressed in flashy clothes and sporting a bold hairstyle, she looked more like a stranger from a different world than a part of our family. It wasn't just her appearance, though. From the moment she entered our house, she made no secret of her disdain for it, or for me. "Wow, this house is so cramped," she'd said, her nose wrinkled in disgust. John, rather than defending his childhood home, had simply laughed along with her. I remember feeling a pang in my heart, wondering how he'd grown so distant and cold toward us. It was hard to accept that this was the same boy we had raised with love and care. Things escalated when they moved in with us a few months ago. My husband Bob, always practical and believing the best in others, agreed to let them stay, thinking it would only be temporary. John had promised they would help with household expenses, but after they settled in, that promise quickly faded. Not only did they refuse to contribute, but they also began to treat our home as if it belonged to them alone. Each day, Catherine found new ways to undermine me, making snide remarks about how easy I had it as an old woman, living off my husband's pension. She and John rarely lifted a finger to help around the house. They criticized everything I did, and whenever Bob was out, they'd mock and laugh at me like I was a mere servant. The worst of it happened a few months ago, just as Bob fell ill from overwork. With him away and me too overwhelmed to cope, their behavior took a darker turn. They started throwing away things that held sentimental value for me. My mother's old dresser, our family's antique dishes. When I confronted them, they dismissed my feelings like they meant nothing. Catherine laughed, saying, "What's the point of keeping junk around?" Despite everything, I kept quiet, hoping things would improve when Bob came back. But as the days dragged on, my patience wore thin. Catherine's arrogance was intolerable, and John, my own son, did nothing to stop her. In fact, he joined in her cruelty, treating me as though I were a stranger in my own home. One day, feeling feverish and exhausted, I decided to lie down on the couch. I thought maybe a little rest would help. But just as I closed my eyes, John and Catherine entered the room, large suitcases in hand, preparing to leave. I asked if they could get me a glass of water, thinking that despite everything, they might show me a little kindness. But Catherine's response chilled me. She sneered, grabbed a wine bottle from the kitchen, and poured it over me, laughing as she watched the liquid soak into my clothes. "You smell terrible," she said with a smirk, walking out with John right behind her, both of them laughing. I lay there, humiliated and drenched, feeling anger and sorrow build up inside me. Just as I was beginning to lose hope, I heard the door open. I looked up to see my husband Bob, his face filled with concern as he rushed over to me. "What happened, Mary?" he asked, his voice a mixture of shock and anger as he took in the sight of me soaked in wine. Overcome with relief, I told him everything about the months of torment, the verbal abuse, the way John and Catherine had made our lives unbearable. I felt a weight lift off my shoulders as I spoke, finally releasing all the hurt and frustration I'd held in. Bob listened silently, his expression growing darker with every word. "We can't let them treat you this way anymore," he said, his tone firm. "This is our home. We deserve peace here." That night, we decided to make a change. We couldn't live like this, constantly being disrespected in our own house. It was time to take control of our lives again, even if it meant drastic measures. We came up with a plan, one that would allow us to escape their grasp once and for all. Within a few weeks, we sold the house, keeping our plan secret. The money we made from the sale would support us in a small rental apartment, somewhere far from John and Catherine. It was a tough decision. We'd loved our home and the memories we'd made there, but it was the only way to break free from the misery they'd brought into our lives. Then, the day finally came. We packed our belongings and moved out, leaving no trace of ourselves behind. I felt a strange mix of sadness and satisfaction as I looked back at the now empty house. It had been our sanctuary once, but now it was a place of painful memories I was ready to leave behind. A few days later, my phone rang. I picked it up, and it was John. "Mom!" he shouted, his voice frantic. "What happened to the house? It's gone." Feigning innocence, I replied, "Oh, you didn't know?" Catherine wanted the place spotless, so we took care of it, down to the last speck of dust. There was silence on the other end, then a torrent of angry words. "How could you? We lived there too. You had no right." I took a deep breath, feeling a strength I hadn't felt in a long time. "John, it was our home, our decision. And after the way you and Catherine treated us, I have no regrets." Catherine took the phone from him, her voice dripping with rage. "You can't just kick us out like this. We have nowhere to go." "Not my problem," I replied calmly. "Perhaps you should have thought of that before you disrespected us." She tried to argue, but I ended the call, feeling a weight lift from my heart. For the first time in months, I felt free. Later that week, we received a visit from our other son, James. His gentle smile and warm hug were a balm to my soul after everything we'd endured. He brought happy news. He was engaged to a wonderful woman named Rachel, and they were planning to marry soon. Bob and I were overjoyed, thrilled to welcome Rachel into our family. For the first time in a long time, we felt a spark of hope and happiness. But our peace was short-lived. One evening, as we were relaxing in our new apartment, there was a knock on the door. I opened it, and to my horror, there stood John, looking disheveled and angry. Somehow he had tracked us down. "You think you can just leave us out on the street?" he shouted, pushing his way inside. Behind him, I noticed a glint of metal. It was a knife. Before I could react, James stepped between us, his voice calm but firm. "John, leave. Now you've done enough damage." John's face twisted with rage, and for a moment, I feared the worst. But then, as if by some miracle, the sound of a police siren filled the air. Our neighbors had called the authorities, and within moments, officers were there, pulling John away, handcuffs clicking around his wrists. As he was led out, he screamed curses at us, his words filled with bitterness and anger. That was the last time we saw him. In the weeks that followed, we learned he had been arrested for other crimes, and Catherine had filed for divorce, leaving him to face the consequences of his actions alone. It was a painful end to a tragic chapter, but one I knew was necessary for us to find peace. As we sat down with James and Rachel for dinner that evening, I looked around the table and felt a warmth fill my heart. Despite everything, we were finally free, ready to start a new chapter surrounded by love and kindness. Our family may have been torn apart, but we had found a way to rebuild, stronger than before. And for the first time in years, I allowed myself to dream of a peaceful, happy future, one where the past could no longer haunt us.